evening, friends. How is everyone doing? I hope everyone is doing well during this holiday season. Happy holidays 2023. And it has been a long time since I did any of these commentary videos. And as you can see, I've kind of sort of changed up the way that this is being shot, because I got some advice from someone saying, the emphasis needs to be more on the upper half of you, including your face, or closer to your face, and not showing your whole body. Okay, well, thanks a lot. But I did take that person at their word, and hopefully these videos will start to look at least a little better. Obviously, I don't have like a Hollywood studio background or something like that, where typically interviews or commentary or whatever, like a distinguished sort of background, the things like that are shot. I remember many years ago I participated in a TV Land interview for the Mary Tyler Moore Show, which was shot at the old but very nice upscale Oceana Hotel on Ocean Avenue over in Santa Monica. And it was, I know TV Land used that location, they used that hotel frequently for interviewing people because it really had a nice background. Well, I don't have the Oceana Hotel in my living room, nor do I, as I say, have a really kind of distinguished looking background or anything like that. But anyway, that's kind of beside the point. I have not done any of these commentaries, not interviews, but commentaries, in a long time. And looking at the YouTube page, the YouTube channel, I see that it has, like, I only did a few at the very beginning of the year, and I did a number of them last year in 2022 and a number of them in 2021, but I really haven't done any this year. I really didn't realize that I'd done so few, but this has been a very, very busy year. So I wanted to, before I launch into my commentaries, and they will be, this will be these commentaries, the commentaries on this video, 3 for the price of 1, Sounds and Silences, Mr. Beavis, and Mute. I will comment on each of those. But before I get into my commentary, I just wanted to read something that came from a friend of mine who made the comment, and this is really this person echoed my feelings exactly. Twilight Zone is really, and I wanted to read a little bit of this email. We are sort of at that point now in Twilight Zone history where it's like the Twilight Zone is, obviously not going away. It will always be seen as a classic, but it has reached that point. It's, it's come to this, juncture within the past, I don't want to say the pandemic, but let's just say within the last score of years, within the last decade, and now we are at that point. Where the series is kind of viewed differently as the younger generations get older, and the up-and-coming generations really, for the most part, don't know the series. Now, please don't throw this back in my face. It's like, oh, there are a lot of younger fans out there. Sure, there are always going to be younger people who watch Twilight Zone. I was quite young when I first started watching it. I was 18 or 19. I didn't grow up with it. I wasn't alive in the early 1960s, and certainly I didn't discover it until I was in my college years. I was much younger than I am now, about 30 years ago, give or take a few years. But anyhow, I just wanted to read this because I really think this is accurate. And this scholar of Twilight Zone mentions it was bound to happen. And within the last, 10 years, I can't really think of any kids who actually became fans and watched a bunch of episodes on their own. This person is a high school teacher. That used to happen 20 plus years ago, but technically the shows are so primitive by kids' standards now that I think it's hard for them to even watch Twilight Zone sometimes. It's so talky, for one thing, and so limited, 2 or 3 actors and a little drama that generally only has 2 or 3 sets. No special effects worthy of the name. Actors they don't recognize, and now really there are less than 100 actors probably from Twilight Zone who are even still around today. Snail's pace editing compared to today, and the stories are so small, so simple. Kids who grow up on Harry Potter are accustomed to long, involved narratives with big casts, not intimate little things that are over in a few minutes. put it all together, and Twilight Zone is just not something any but the most artistically ambitious students will be able to relate to. In a way, it might be kind of like the 1930s, a bit like the 1930s after silent movies had gone away, or the 1960s after the death of radio drama. The forms just became too old and out of date for any but specialists and hobbyists, and I think that's where we are right now with Twilight Zone. It will remain a classic, of course, but with fewer and fewer people actually watching as time goes on. I mean, in recent critic polls, even something like Citizen Kane has fallen from its lofty perch as the greatest film of all time, because younger critics can't relate to it. So I think that's really quite an accurate statement about where things are as far as Twilight Zone right now. Depressing though that might be. But why do we do these commentaries, and why are the Twilight Zone flames still lit? It's because there are enough people who do watch it and pay attention to it and know that it really was and always will be the greatest television series of all time. So I wanted to talk about these 3 episodes. None of them are popular, which will probably which is probably why it will not probably take me as long to comment on these 3 as it would some others that are a little bit deeper. Actually, one of them is deep, but because that was the last one on this tape, I'll leave that for last. And what am I doing with old Columbia House Twilight Zone tapes? That's kind of a story in itself, which I won't go into. But needless to say, I recently acquired this collection of all, I think, 43 tapes that were released a long time ago. And this actually has not even been removed from the shrink wrap yet. Okay, so Sounds and Silences was done in the last year of the show and stars John MacGyver. And John MacGyver was a school teacher turned character actor who himself supposedly had like 10 children. And I remember a long time ago, one of his sons emailed me about something that he saw one of his dad's photos on the website. And he said, yeah, John was my dad. He died a long time ago now. And he was a very familiar face for a while, I think in the 50s, 60s, and I think he died in the 70s. So he had maybe about 20 years there as a rather prolific character actor. And he plays this man who is the owner of a model shipbuilding company. And he loves the sound of loud noises. And so he just kind of goes through the day, and one of his ways of unwinding when he comes home from work is listening to these record albums of, you know, torpedoing and so forth from World War I or II or something. And his wife cannot stand the sight of this, cannot stand the sounds, and she leaves him. And his wife is played by Penny Singleton, who was a great old-time actress who was big in the 30s, and I think Twilight Zone was probably about one of the last things she did. But she was also known, if I'm not mistaken, for playing a cartoon character, and I believe she did the voice of, it wasn't Wilma on the Flintstones. Maybe it was Judy Jetson. I'm sorry, I don't know cartoon trivia all that well. But anyway, if you're interested, Google it. But that was Penny Singleton, and I think she did the voice of Jane Jetson. I'll Google it after I'm done with this, and I'll find out for sure. So anyway. But what happens with this guy, Flemington, who likes all this loud noise, and his wife leaves him, is one day or one night he suddenly finds that like all these kind of small noises, like he goes to sleep and he's woken up by the sound of a dripping drain or, you know, something like that. So all these kind of small, unimportant noises really start to bother him. And I think what happens is he sort of goes deaf and insane by the end of it. And ultimately, nobody is really the wiser for it. But it was directed by Richard Donner, of all people, the great director Richard Donner, one of 6 he directed that season. And it was really kind of a funny script. It was rather, in a way, sort of lackluster. There wasn't a whole lot of action. But, you know, we see this guy Flemington sort of go through a day, and you know, and then this sort of weird thing happens to him overnight where, you know, he starts being bothered by these smaller noises, and he goes to work and, you know, hears the sound of like squeaking shoes and stuff like that, and then everything just really goes quiet, and then, you know, he wants, you know, more noise again, but by the end, he's basically gone deaf and insane, as I say, and ends up in a sanitarium, and that was kind of the end of it. So this episode, Sounds and Silences, was not in syndication for more than 20 years. I think, it was one of those ideas that somebody else, staked a claim to, and it was one of a number of times that happened on the show. And ultimately, it was not in syndication for 20 years, and then ultimately, whoever filed the lawsuit or whatever, they forgot about it, or they passed away, or it had been so long that it really didn't matter anymore. And then it went. It's been in syndication probably now for the last 40 years, but for the first 20 years, it was just never seen until maybe videotape came out, and then it entered reruns. Okay, so Mr. Beavis is the second one on this tape, and that starred the wonderful Orson Bean, who just died here a couple of years ago at a very old age. He lived with his wife, Allie Mills, who people know mostly for her playing of Norma Arnold, the mom in the Wonder Years, the long-running Wonder Years, Fred Savage's mom on the Wonder Years. And he was hit by a car, unfortunately, and never recovered. Hit by a car, I think, at night. He was inconspicuous and just never recovered and passed away. But he lived a very good long life. He was a funny guy. I remember he was a panelist on Match Game for a while, and had a lot of really good roles. I remember also he had a role kind of later in his career on Will and Grace, playing one of Will's old college professors or something like that. And Piper Laurie was in this, and she just died here recently, if I'm not mistaken. They played like husband and wife couple. Anyway, so Mr. Beavis starred Orson Bean, and it was one of these guardian angel stories similar to what Serling did later for Carol Burnett in the episode Cavender is Coming. So Mr. Beavis was intended as a spin-off. It did not get picked up, but it was one of these Serling, who had a weakness for guardian angel type stories, and this guy gets a helping hand from an angel, guardian angel, only who doesn't have wings. He's just kind of a plainclothes angel named Hempstead, played by a wonderful actor named Henry Jones, who was very prolific back in the 50s and 60s. He must have been in about 200 films. But he had kind of a distinct sort of voice. Kind of sounded like Andy Devine, who was also in Twilight Zone. He had kind of a sort of high-pitched drawl, and Cloris Leachman recruited him. I think it was after they worked together on Night Gallery. She recruited him for playing her father-in-law on her sitcom Phyllis. So anyway, this is guardian angel story about this guy who's sort of down and out, and he gets evicted and fired from his job and everything, and then this angel helps him, and things maybe get a little better for him momentarily, and then ultimately he decides, Mr. Beavis, I don't dig you, and then he abandons him, sort of, but not completely. He'll still be by his side, but he sort of disappears by the end of it. And it had a number of really good actors who had very small parts. One of them was the great Charles Lane, who everybody knows. He lived to be about 105 years old. Died, I think, about 15 years ago. And what was her name? Dorothy Newman, who was also kind of a familiar face. She played a murderess on Perry Mason. And she also played Otis Campbell's wife on the Andy Griffith Show. And Colleen O'Sullivan, who was not a big name at all, but she was a friend of mine, Gloria Paul, who people know from Twilight Zone. So anyhow, so Mr. Beavis was also, I can't leave off William Shallard, the great character actor William Shallard, who was like in every TV show in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. And Dobie Gillis, he was on Dobie Gillis as the teacher. I forget the name of the teacher, but yeah, he played the teacher, the high school teacher in Dobie Gillis. And very nice man. He came to both of our Twilight Zone conventions, and just legendary character actor, super familiar face. He was, like I said, he was in everything. So that was Mr. Beavis. And now, finally, I will dive into Mute. And Mute was one of those episodes that was very controversial at the time. I don't think it is now maybe as much, because people kind of let it go as far as what it was. But it was about this story of a girl whose parents raised her to be telepathic, and they spoke only telepathically with her, and this was the result of a pact that was made in Germany some 10 years before. And now she's like 10 years old, and they're living in the United States, and her parents die in a house fire, but she herself gets out of the fire and survives. And she's adopted by the sheriff and his wife, and goes to school, and basically the telepathy is broken. Now, the reason I think this was kind of an objectionable kind of episode, and it probably still is to some people, it is not really what I'd call an enjoyable episode of the Twilight Zone. It kind of makes its points and so forth, but Matheson, I think, really wrote a very fine short story, but I think the teleplay was just a little over the top. And what really pushed it over the top, I think, was the choice of who played some of the parts, and also in the way that the teleplay, as opposed to the short story, was written. And Barbara Baxley and Frank Overton played the parents, and I think Barbara Baxley was horrendously, let's just say, not miscast, but she portrayed the mother in such a way that was, quite, kind of at the brink of what might almost be called unacceptable. And she plays this terrible woman who, burns letters written by her husband, the sheriff, who's trying to get in touch with the people from Europe who might know, where any of her relatives are, the girl's relatives are. And then, of course, there's a school teacher played by Irene Daly, who is one of the not only bitchiest characters in all of Twilight Zone, but I think the way the part was written was just quite extreme. And I think the thing that makes the whole thing kind of passable was Anne Gillian's bravura performance. And she said the whole thing was written out all over her face. And you hear her, voiceovers, but she really acted. She really and truly acted, and I think she was only about 12 or 13 years old at the time, but gave a very convincing performance despite only having, a few lines at the end when she breaks out and finally says, "My name is Ilsa," over and over again. But I think the teleplay, as I say, really took many, many wrong turns, and it's not a popular one today. And Frank Overton, I should say, who is usually wonderful in everything, displays none of the sensitivity and whatever else, or the lovingness that he did in Walking Distance a few years earlier, or that he displayed in To Kill a Mockingbird, which was done about the film To Kill a Mockingbird, of course. It was done right around the same time. And Irene Daly, I remember getting a note from her some time ago, and she made the comment, it was only my second time in Hollywood. I was always based in New York, and she said it was her only second time in Hollywood, and she said working for that director, Stuart Rosenberg, who later cast her in the Amityville Horror film or films. She said working with him was always just a joy, but she said they always flew us out to Hollywood. Then I started, flying out to Hollywood for the juicy roles. She said they always flew us out for the juicier roles. But at 1 hour, this was, being an hour-long episode, this was one example of yes, they had more time to work with this rather complicated thesis, but at the same time, it really didn't work out as well. And as I say, it's not a popular one, and probably never will be. But I think it does make its points, and I think when Matheson sort of was asked to defend it, he said, well, she lost her, her parents died, but, now she'll probably have a normal life. So it's like 6 of one, half dozen of the other. I think that was kind of his quote. It's like, well, take the bad with the good, and, now she is probably going to have a better life, given that, she's not going to be an outcast. Now she's with parents who, supposedly can give her a better sort of existence. But the way, as I say, the way that her adoptive mother, played by Barbara Baxley, was portrayed, it was just, there's the one scene where Ilsa sees her burning these letters that had just been written, burning them in a pan on the stove, and then she, confused and just absolutely, flabbergasted by this. She, Ilsa runs out of the house, runs into the street, and there are all these. It was very badly staged. They had like all these. The director had all these onlookers and stuff who, see her running out into the street, almost hit by a car, and she's like, it's like, what am I going to do? And then out runs Barbara Baxley playing her mother. Outruns her mother, saying, leave her alone, And meanwhile, they didn't do anything. She's saying, leave me alone to these concerned onlookers. But she sees Ilsa as the daughter, her dead daughter returned to her, because her own biological daughter, their own biological daughter, the sheriff and his wife, was killed, or she drowned in a boating accident or something. Drowned in the lake, and so now this mother is imagining that Ilsa is her daughter brought back in a different form, or her daughter has been sort of brought back to her thanks to Ilsa, whose parents died in a fire. So that is the controversial episode Mute, and I did hear one person who had a big mouth say, all copies of Mute and 3 or 4 other episodes in The Encounter from season 5, all copies of Mute and The Encounter and whatever else, The Howling Man, I think, and also The Hunt by Earl Hamner, they should all be, all copies should be found and burned in a big bonfire, recalled. So this was many years ago on one of the old Twilight Zone message boards. So, as I say, I'm glad to be back doing some of these commentaries again, and I'll try to do more than in the future. I am a busy person, and time got away from me. I really didn't realize that I hadn't really done any this year, except for a few at the very beginning of the year. So, continue in the next video.